You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
I'd like to start this week's Dixie Heritage Hour with a speech that the President gave earlier this week in reaction to the shootings that took place this weekend. When I heard this speech, I was just flabbergasted. I was floored. I was driving my truck, actually, and it was on the Sean Hannity show. And I just lost all respect for Sean Hannity, the way he responded to it. He was rah-rah cheerleader for this speech that, as the President was giving it, I was thinking in my mind, wow, this violates the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the 10th Amendment. And, you know, if I were to actually take and reread the first 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights in the Constitution, I would probably be able to articulate even more violation. I just could not believe that the President was so eager to give the Marxists everything that they've ever asked for, and then some. It did not surprise me when those on the left began screaming gun control, when they began screaming draconian laws that would be able to throw people in psychological prisons, when they began to scream and shout, all white people are evil. You know, I've grown brain numb to hearing those things. But to hear the President agree with them and to promise that he was going to make all of their political wet dreams, if you will, come true, I just didn't know how to react. Before this show becomes very critical of the President, which it will today, what I'd like to start out with is actually play the President's speech in its entirety. It's about 9 minutes, so that we cannot be accused of having taken the President out of context. And then what I'm going to do is I have 4 panelists that I'm going to call on the phone. The first is Clint Lacy, the author of the book, The Beginner's Guide to False Flags. The second is Pat Shannan, investigative journalist and former editor of the American Free Press. The third being Rick Tyler, who is the American Freedom Party's candidate in the upcoming 2020 presidential election. He'll be running against President Trump. Then finally, I called Simon Roche there in South Africa because as I was listening to the President, it was almost as if the President was declaring war against his own country. Simon lives in a country where its government has declared war against its own citizens, particularly its own white citizens, blaming white people for every problem under their sun. And so I asked these 4 people, am I overreacting to this? If I'm overreacting to this, please, dial me back, bring me down, show me reality. Rather than putting words into our guests' mouths, I'll let them speak for themselves in a moment. Before that, let's listen to the President.
A wicked man went to a Walmart store where families were shopping with their loved ones. He shot and murdered 20 people and injured 26 others, including precious children. Then, in the early hours of Sunday morning, in Dayton, Ohio, another twisted monster opened fire on a crowded downtown street. He murdered 9 people, including his own sister, and injured 27 others. The First Lady and I join all Americans in praying and grieving for the victims, their families, and the survivors. We will stand by their side forever. We will never forget. These barbaric slaughters are an assault upon our communities, an attack upon our nation, and a crime against all of humanity. We are outraged and sickened by this monstrous evil, the cruelty, the hatred, the malice, the bloodshed, and the terror. Our hearts are shattered for every family whose parents, children, husbands, and wives were ripped from their arms and their lives. America weeps for the fallen. We are a loving nation, and our children are entitled to grow up in a just, peaceful, and loving society. Together, we lock arms to shoulder the grief. We ask God in heaven to ease the anguish of those who suffer, and we vow to act with urgent resolve. I want to thank the many law enforcement personnel who responded to these atrocities with the extraordinary grace and courage of American heroes. I have spoken with Texas Governor Greg Abbott and Ohio Governor Mike DeWine, as well as Mayor DeMargo of El Paso, Texas, and Mayor Nan Whaley of Dayton, Ohio, to express our profound sadness and unfailing support. Today, we also send the condolences of our nation to President Obrador of Mexico and all the people of Mexico for the loss of their citizens in the El Paso shooting. Terrible, terrible thing. I have also been in close contact with Attorney General Barr and FBI Director Wray. Federal authorities are on the ground, and I have directed them to provide any and all assistance required, whatever is needed. The shooter in El Paso posted a manifesto online consumed by racist hate. In one voice, our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. These sinister ideologies must be defeated. Hate has no place in America. Hatred warps the mind, ravages the heart, and devours the soul. We have asked the FBI to identify all further resources they need to investigate and disrupt hate crimes and domestic terrorism, whatever they need. We must recognize that the internet has provided a dangerous avenue to radicalize disturbed minds and perform demented acts. We must shine light on the dark recesses of the internet and stop mass murders before they start. The internet, likewise, is used for human trafficking, illegal drug distribution, and so many other heinous crimes. The perils of the internet and social media cannot be ignored, and they will not be ignored. In the 2 decades since Columbine, our nation has watched with rising horror and dread as one mass shooting has followed another, over and over again, decade after decade. We cannot allow ourselves to feel powerless. We can and will stop this evil contagion. In that task, we must honor the sacred memory of those we have lost by acting as one people. Open wounds cannot heal if we are divided. We must seek real bipartisan solutions. We have to do that in a bipartisan manner that will truly make America safer and better for all. First, we must do a better job of identifying and acting on early warning signs. I am directing the Department of Justice to work in partnership with local, state, and federal agencies, as well as social media companies, to develop tools that can detect mass shooters before they strike. As an example, the monster in the Parkland High School in Florida had many red flags against him, and yet nobody took decisive action. Nobody did anything. Why not? Second, we must stop the glorification of violence in our society. This includes the gruesome and grisly video games that are now commonplace. It is too easy today for troubled youth to surround themselves with a culture that celebrates violence. We must stop or substantially reduce this, and it has to begin immediately. Cultural change is hard, but each of us can choose to build a culture that celebrates the inherent worth and dignity of every human life. That's what we have to do. Third, we must reform our mental health laws to better identify mentally disturbed individuals who may commit acts of violence and make sure those people not only get treatment, but when necessary, involuntary confinement. Mental illness and hatred pulls the trigger, not the gun. Fourth, we must make sure that those judged to pose a grave risk to public safety do not have access to firearms, and that if they do, those firearms can be taken through rapid due process. That is why I have called for red flag laws, also known as extreme risk protection orders. Today, I'm also directing the Department of Justice to propose legislation ensuring that those who commit hate crimes and mass murders face the death penalty, and that this capital punishment be delivered quickly, decisively, and without years of needless delay. These are just a few of the areas of cooperation that we can pursue. I am open and ready to listen and discuss all ideas that will actually work and make a very big difference. Republicans and Democrats have proven that we can join together in a bipartisan fashion to address this plague. Last year, we enacted the Stop School Violence and Fix NICS Acts into law, providing grants to improve school safety and strengthening critical background checks for firearm purchases. At my direction, the Department of Justice banned bump stocks. Last year, we prosecuted a record number of firearms offenses. But there is so much more that we have to do. Now is the time to set destructive partisanship aside, so destructive, and find the courage to answer hatred with unity, devotion, and love. Our future is in our control. America will rise to the challenge. We will always have, and we always will, win. The choice is ours, and ours alone. It is not up to mentally ill monsters. It is up to us. If we are able to pass great legislation after all of these years, we will ensure that those who were attacked will not have died in vain. May God bless the memory of those who perished in Toledo. May God protect them. May God protect all of those from Texas to Ohio. May God bless the victims and their families. May God bless America. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So I've got Clint Lacy on the phone. I guess let's start, Clint, with a shameless promotion of your book.
Called A Beginner's Guide to False Flags, close to 300 pages, and it covers everything from the American Revolution through President Trump's election in Charlottesville. It's available at Amazon.com. You can also visit foothillsmedia.net. Find the links there as well.
But let's talk about this weekend, or this past weekend, which will actually be 2 weekends ago when this airs. But, you know, the whole thing in El Paso, let me tell you what has me triggered on this, and then you can give us your expert analysis. First of all, is this shooting supposedly took place in a Walmart. I don't know how many Walmarts I've been in. I've been in probably a couple hundred Walmarts around the country. I'm sure you've been in a lot of Walmarts. All you got to do is look at the ceiling. All you got to do is look at the end caps. All you got to do is look around the store. Every 5 feet in any direction, there is a Walmart security camera. And so you mean to tell me the only footage of this thing that anybody can find is something that a woman shot on her cell phone? You mean that all of Walmart's security cameras were not working that day? And the other thing is, you've heard the president's comments. You know, he's calling for, every time there's an event like this, the left is calling for something. You know, they want gun control. They want red flag laws. You know, they want the ability to basically throw people in psychiatric prisons. You know, they want something. But this time, not only are they calling for everything at once, the president is saying he wants to give it to them. It's just mind-blowing. And since you're the author of False Flags, the False Flags books, I thought I'd get your expert opinion. Either tell me I'm right or walk me back and tell me I'm crazy and I just need to calm down.
I don't think you're crazy. This whole thing was set up in both locations. Either it was set up in both locations or they quickly jumped on it to try and get what they want, like you say. One post, it shows him walking into, across the parking lot into the Walmart, kind of the crosswalk area there, and stop is painted on the pavement. Supposedly they had photographs of this particular Walmart. Stop is not on the pavement, yield is. Second, the guy bears an uncanny resemblance to the shooter in California at the Garlic Festival, as well as the Dayton shooter. I'm not saying they're the same person. I'm saying they look an awful lot alike. Another thing that struck me odd, there was talk about investigating the FBI, and all of a sudden, 2 shootings happen in one weekend. Those subjects are just totally not in the news cycle now. They're gone. I read in a few trusted sources that Peter Strzok, suddenly he's taking meetings with the present FBI director, Wray, and he still has all his top security clearance. How is this possible? How come Wray is taking meetings with him? It's all very suspicious. Now, you mentioned Trump's speech. I've heard a lot of people And I've seen videos, people have shot videos saying, criticizing people for jumping off the Trump train because of the proposed red flag laws. Well, I didn't say I was dropping off the Trump train. I'm certainly not going to kiss his behind when I think he's making a bad move. It's okay to criticize the president. That's your right, and that's your duty. But the speech he gave sickened me because the El Paso shooter, it has now come out that Trump did not trigger him. He said the Democrats in the debates triggered him. The Dayton, Ohio shooter, it has come out, and I've seen it from several sources. He was extremely liberal. He was into, I don't know what you would call it, maybe torture porn, I guess you could say. Really violent pornography that subjects women. And he had links to Antifa. Now, one thing I have not heard from anybody, I've not heard it from the president, I've not heard it from the media, is this gentleman's link to Antifa. But yet the president declares white supremacy as the main motivating factor. I'm sorry, I can't support that. When he blames white supremacy and says nothing about Antifa. Before this happened, he put out a few tweets. I'm seriously looking into declaring Antifa a domestic terrorist organization. He hasn't done it. And not only has he not done it, he's blamed all white people. Now, how can white people be the problem when white people are the ones attacked for wearing Trump hats? How can it be white people when it's our monuments coming down? As an example, Confederate Railroad at the DuQuoin State Fair in Illinois, about an hour and a half northeast of me, they bumped them off the schedule because it wasn't appropriate since their logo has a couple of tiny little bit of Confederate flags on the train, and they simply don't like the name. Who defines what a white supremacist is? I don't think I'm better than anybody else, but I'm certainly not going to support a president or an agenda who supports the attacks against me and against whites. This was a very, very bad move on his part. And I don't know about you, but I didn't elect this particular president. I didn't vote for him to listen to his advisors. He captured our vote by telling it like it was, like it is, going off the script. And now he's on the script. All of these things are very disturbing to me.
And you can tell when he's on script and when he's not, because there's a certain passion to his speaking, like at his rallies and things. And yet you can tell You can tell when he's reading his speech, and he was obviously reading the one that he gave.
Very monotone, unenthusiastic, like you said, no passion. And all of a sudden, a couple of shootings happen at a time that's suspicious, and white supremacists are to blame, And like I said, you tell me who gets to make the definition of a white supremacist.
Did you see my interview with Simon Roche? Because Simon explained how the so-called white supremacists and racists and so forth, he said there are none on the right of the spectrum. They're all on the left, and the reason why, he said the very notion of white supremacism is an elitist position. He said, and where are all the elitists? They're on the left.
Yeah, and I'd have to agree with him on that. The term racist is a communist term. They use it to try and browbeat people, keep them from talking. If you say anything that's off the script or off the accepted norm, their accepted norm, you're a racist. And like I said, I don't think I'm better than anybody else. I don't think I should be made to accept attacks on my heritage. I'm sorry, but every other ethnic group in this country and every other cultural group and every other sexual group, they have their months, they have their days. Now, music that we identify with, symbols we identify with, history that we proudly identify with is unacceptable. A lot of Confederate groups are being banned from county fairs and parades. And another thing, when these monuments come down, nothing is done to these people who just climb up or tie a chain to a monument or graffiti it. They might get charged, and then the charges get dropped. The people on our side, if they defend themselves against these people when attacked, they're going to rot in a jail cell.
Well, there's one guy who's not going to spend the rest of his life in jail simply because he tried to get in his car and drive away.
The whole Charlottesville thing was a total setup. Which a black guy that was there in Charlottesville, he stated he saw Black Lives Matter, Antifa, the Klan, and Nazis get off the same bus. And not only did they get off the same bus, they went into a local restaurant and had lunch together and chatted it up like they were old buddies.
Remember that cartoon where the coyote and the roadrunner would punch the time clock, then they'd chase each other, and then they'd punch the clock again, and they'd eat lunch together, then they'd punch the clock, and they'd chase each other, then they'd punch the clock, and they'd put on their hats and they'd say, "Okay, Charlie, see you tomorrow."
Yeah, it was good morning and evening, and it was business as usual. And that's exactly what this is. And it's clear to me this was cultivated and set up, Charlottesville that is, because you had the vice mayor. He started this thing off about they needed to change the park names. They needed to remove the monuments of Lee and Jackson, bring the community together. Jason Kessler and some other people start doing research. And a few previous years before that, West Bellamy is making vulgar racist tweets about white people that I can't even repeat on your show. There were so many of them, blatantly racist, but he's not called a racist. So it was orchestrated, and they created that environment in which violence would happen. And then, much like this shooting, whose fault was it? White supremacists. It's clear what the agenda is, and I don't like it.
Well, I almost got the impression just before the shooting, I was seeing some members of Congress and some presidential candidates on the Democrat side making some statements almost to the effect that we have this problem in our country with white supremacy. And, something has to be done, and the FBI has to be empowered because they have all these powers to deal with foreign terrorists. But what about these domestic terrorists, these white supremacist, radicalized domestic terrorists and so forth? And then, boom, El Paso, and then, even the president himself is up there and saying, well, okay, now we need to empower the FBI because we have all these hateful white people. As I was listening to the speech, the verbiage of it, it was almost as if the president was declaring war against his own country.
Yeah, I would agree with that. At least part of it, us.
Yeah.
What a horrible decision this is, especially for a guy that's got a year and a half to get reelected, and he declares war on the people that elected him. And it's like I said, who defines what a white supremacist is?
I think Joe Scarborough's a white supremacist because he's a white guy who thinks he's better than everybody else.
He's an idiot.
The North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets, and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting ncheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.ncheritagepac.org. And help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org. Next call is to investigative journalist Pat Shannan. Pat, of course, for many years was the editor of the American Free Press, and he's been covering events like this for longer than I've been alive, and his insight and his commentary is always very valuable. So, Pat, glad to have you back on the show.
Good morning.
So I know that you have heard the president's comments. I've had Clint Lacy on the show, and I've talked to Rick Tyler already, and I basically explained to him that as I was listening to the president, I got the impression that he was declaring war against me. He was declaring war against the very people who elected him. He was pretty much declaring war against America itself, or at least white America. Am I crazy? Do I need to be dialed back and brought back into reality, or am I reading this stuff correctly? I mean, you've been analyzing this stuff for 40 years now.
We must remember that who's leading him. He's got a gun to his head, and somebody writes those scripts for him, those speeches for him, and probably had not had a chance to find out until the next day that Dayton thing was BS, as well as El Paso. He might have that moment believed the BS coming out of El Paso about that white supremacist crap. I've said from the beginning that he's not going to be able to accomplish as much as he's bragging about in his campaign because of who runs the country. And, Satan's chosen people have got him by the proverbials too. So, you want to believe in the guy, you want to trust him, and then he says something stupid like this. You say, like you get frustrated as you are right now.
As you know, every time something like this happens, there's always a cry, usually from the left, okay, we need more gun control. We need red flag laws. We need psychiatric analysis laws. We need this. We need that. We need to criminalize this, or we need a gun buyback program, or, there's always something that they tout as the answer. We need more law enforcement, more police power, or so forth. But this time around, the left was asking for everything at once, and the president was on television saying, I want to give it to him. That's never happened before. The other thing that kind of concerns me, as you listen to Joe Biden's comments, Joe Biden is coming out stronger on the Second Amendment this week than the president is. Joe Biden was even saying how, as much as he would like to do some of this stuff, constitutionally, he doesn't know how it could be done. How do you wrap your head around this stuff, Pat?
Everything they ever told us was a lie. And it was straight out of Orwell now. Telling the truth is a revolutionary act. Almost everything in the mainstream is some kind of exaggerated or if not totally fake news, not totally fiction.
Since I've got you here, Pat, why don't you just go ahead and give us a shameless plug for your book, Everything They Ever Told Us Was a Lie?
It's almost 10 years old now, but the stuff in there that I wrote about back in, I think it was 2011, it pretty much been exposed on the internet and YouTube. Well, when you go to my iniworldreport.com and check the books, there's some very, very complimentary remarks and comments in there about that book and the details. One guy just commented on the very obscure story I told about the bogusness of Ronald Reagan. Well, most, conservatives don't want to hear that about their hero. I think it's still my most popular edition of the 9 books that I've written. Everything They Ever Told Me Was a Lie seems to be the public's favorite.
So this stuff that we're talking about, Pat, is it stuff that you're covering for any news agencies right now?
Ed, is just keep an eye on the website, iniworldreport.com, because we update that about 2 or 3 times every day with suppressed news, stuff that people are not going to see on the TV in the evening or the morning paper. Of course, it's loaded right now. The last page probably is loaded with the headlines about the shootings. And did you see the television blurb that the local Fox carrier in El Paso read the attack at Walmart before it happened?
No, I didn't.
Oh, well, we posted it. Because it's another Building 7 deal like BBC did back in 01 when they reported the Building 7 falling 23 minutes before it did, and then there was a Building 7 behind the reporter in the distance out the window already standing while she's talking, so that made it look pretty stupid. But here we got the same thing, and it's kind of a hoot. The woman says that, yes, there seems to have been some kind of shooting at Walmart. Let's see. That hasn't happened yet.
Well, let's cue that up. I've been able to pull that off of your website. So let's go ahead and play that for our listeners.
At the Walmart in Horizon. I'm not sure what time this tweet went out. However, here it is, at 3 p.m. Well, that hasn't happened yet. Okay, so today is the 3rd.
So sure enough, there was the Fox 14, a newscast there in El Paso, and the newscaster comes right out and says, that hadn't even happened yet. So that's just mind-blowing.
George Washington said, when government takes away citizens' rights to bear arms, it becomes citizens' duty to take away government's right to govern.
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, That's www.barnesreview.org. You can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. Now I've got on the phone Rick Tyler. He is the chairman of the American Freedom Party and also a 2020 presidential candidate. So, Rick, confirm for us that you definitely are running for president in 2020. That's the rumor that I'm hearing. Is that true?
Yes, I'm going to be the standard bearer for the American Freedom Party.
I remember that you had made the comment a long time ago, maybe a year or so ago now, the American Freedom Party should not run a candidate for president in 2020. The party would support Trump, and then probably in 2024 would have a candidate when not only would there be a bunch of Democrats to oppose, but probably the Republican candidate would be Mike Pence or some other rhino that wouldn't be worthy of support. Obviously, you've reversed course on that position. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about why?
Well, no, I never did articulate that position. Somebody else may have said that. Earl Holt, of course, has a proponent of that position. But no, I announced myself in 2016 that I was running for the American Freedom Party nomination, to run for president in 2020, and have never wavered from that intention. I, for one, have never been impressed with Donald Trump in terms of thinking that he was for real. I have always stated, even in 2016, that he was enormously entertaining, that there was a lot of what he said and did that obviously we couldn't help but like, but that I've never trusted him because, as Roosevelt said, if it happens in politics, you can be sure that it was planned. In modern America, you can't be elected president on the Republican Party ticket, no matter how, unusual you are in terms of being measured up against what has been, the status quo standard candidacies of my lifetime. Still, even if you're Donald Trump, you can't be elected unless the hidden hand of power smiles propitiously upon you. And so I've always understood that Trump was part of this gargantuan dialectic materialism that the enemy has been orchestrating for multiple generations now, and that at the right time, under the right circumstances, he would throw us under the bus formally and officially without even a nanosecond of hesitation. If you can produce somewhere where I have said that I wasn't going to run in 2020 or that the American Party shouldn't field a candidate, then that will just be proof of my, devolving into some kind of mental lapse. But I have believed all along that we need to have a candidacy coming from our perspective, because where else are people going to even get a glimmer or a sliver of truth from?
You've heard the president's comments. As a political candidate and as somebody who very potentially could be in the position in a few years to be giving such a speech himself, let me just tell you that my impression of listening to that speech was that the president just declared war on me. And
well, I think that that's an understatement, but it's very nuanced and it's subtle to the point where people who don't have your perspective, my perspective, Clint Lacy's perspective, will consider that to be a radical, extreme, and maybe even crazy statement.
Whenever something like this happens, the left is always demanding something. They're demanding some type of gun control. They're demanding red flag laws. They're demanding the ability to lock people up in psychiatric prisons, demanding increase of police powers. They're demanding the creation of a new government agency. They're demanding something in response to it. After this weekend, they're demanding everything at once, and the president's saying he wants to give it all to them.
Yes, and let's remember that sea change events of an ultra negative consequence virtually always happen under ostensible conservative Republican administrations. Remember, it was under Nixon that we betrayed Taiwan and normalized with the murderous communist Chinese. It was under George Bush that 9/11 happened, rolling out of the Department of Homeland Security and the complete, total evisceration of the Bill of Rights. So it only follows logically that, during a Donald Trump probably involving a second term, that's when things will really get diabolical and insidious, that we would have what you're describing, the next major nail in the coffin lid. And I think we're witnessing an event that is a major component of that rollout right now. God only knows what else they have planned and in store.
Let me ask you this, as the leader of a political party, you might have some insight into this possibility. Donald Trump has to be reelected, and he has a year and a couple of months left to get himself reelected. If he were to do things like this and, declaring war against what reportedly is his base, those aren't the actions of a man who wants to get reelected. So is the fix already in and it doesn't matter? Do you think that Trump is going to dial this stuff back and at least wait until the second term to even discuss it again, simply because, as I said, as this stuff starts to go up the political ladder, with every rung that it rises, his chances of reelection, at least in an honest and normal society, would become less and less?
Well, I think the extreme nature, politically speaking and ideologically speaking, of what is evolving into, what will be Trump's opposition in 2020 is so far off the chart, in terms of liberalism, radicalism, Marxist leftism, that no matter what Trump does, as long as it is couched in, terminology such as what we witnessed at the press conference, the contradictory terminology, but again, you have to be very alert to pick up on it. As long as it doesn't go completely over the edge and have some level of rapidity, isn't expedited so that it happens in the next, few months or 6 months or whatever, but instead takes that gradual implementation process that they are so skilled at, the people really, will have no choice but to vote for Trump unless they are part of that element that really does resonate with the Democratic candidates, all of whom, of course, now are, just flagrant, outright, socialists and radicals. It has become impossible to distinguish them. 30, 40 years ago, we would have just simply readily acknowledged, was tantamount to Marxist, communistic type approach, to attempting to govern a country or run a country. Anything that Trump does, as long as he maintains the imagery of his big rallies, and as long as he retains a modicum, of him being the nemesis of this left-wing element, and as long as the economy continues to be artificially propped up, gas prices remain relatively low, Trump is, I believe, going to win in 2020, not because he's anything great, not because he's a genuine friend of Americana, but because the alternative is so extreme that the country, in terms of a numerical majority or the electoral college, is not yet ready for what the left has become. That won't happen until 2024. That's when the coup de grace will happen. After Trump serves a second term, or maybe he won't even finish a second term. Maybe it'll be another, repetition of the Nixon phenomenon where, he wins handily, as Nixon did in 72, but then gets drummed out, because the powers that be choose to make the quote unquote scandal, so omnipresent, that even people within his own party turn against him. Who knows? I mean, all of this is just prognostication on our part. The fix is in, one way or the other. The abject attack upon and the warfare against our liberty, our ability to even survive as a people, devoid of some genocidal campaign against us, a la, what's happening in South Africa, barring some extraordinary event, that would be driven by divine intervention. And I don't see us really being deserving of that at this point.
You listen to the president's comments, and then I listen to Joe Biden's comments. And even in talking about how Joe Biden is going to grab our guns, he seems like he has a better understanding of the Second Amendment than the president does. And even Joe Biden was walking back some of Trump's comments saying, I don't see how legally, constitutionally, you can do that. So,
well, remember,
so how do I wrap my head around the fact that Joe Biden is the one who's coming out being the, I don't want to say I'm the right position on this because he's not, but he's more correct than the president.
That's part of how this game is played. Thesis, antithesis, or antithesis, and then synthesis. And if Biden is going to be the designated Democrat for Trump to run against, then it would make sense that at a point in time like this, that he would be coming across more as the good old boy, an anachronism from a bygone era, out of touch. He kind of has this little, suppressed but very real affinity, even for something such as the Second Amendment. But yes, you're right. What a crazy upside down world we live in, where Joe Biden or Alan Dershowitz or, people of this ilk, Rudy Giuliani, sometimes, sound like, they're, on the right side of things just because they're being juxtaposed against this ultra, radical left. Now, remember in 2016, when Rush Limbaugh was first warming up to Trump, was trying to explain to his listeners about Donald Trump, he would always say, Trump is not ideological. Go on to say that Trump obviously has a lot of the right instincts, but that Trump was not an ideological conservative. He was not ideological in terms of his commitment to fiscal conservatism, to constitutional governance. So this would go right along with what I believe was Limbaugh's correct analysis of Trump at that time. Trump really doesn't have any ideological commitment to the Bill of Rights, to the Second Amendment. Trump is an art of the deal guy. If you have to give your enemy even sometimes major concessions in order to achieve your broader goal, so be it. Compromise. And
he even said himself over the last couple of days that he will give the Democrats everything they want in gun control in exchange for everything that he wants on immigration and the border. And if that's not the swap that they're willing to make, then he'll give it to them piecemeal. In other words, he'll give them this piece of gun control for this piece of the border, this piece of gun control for this piece of immigration, and so forth.
Right. And that proves prima facie that Donald Trump is not who a lot of our people want to believe he is. Because without the Second Amendment, what else do we have? Ultimately, without the teeth of liberty, there can be no liberty.
Maybe Donald Trump is just reading the script and he's just playing the role and he's doing it exactly the way he was told. Or maybe the powers that be are actually kind of letting Trump think that he's driving the train. But in either event, if the plan is to swap gun control for a border wall, and that plan is allowed to take place, not only do the powers that should not be get all of their gun control and disarm the populace, they've now just built a wall around us, not to keep people out, but to put us into prison. Or am I just crazy?
And Ron Paul back in 2008 was saying that very thing in the Republican debates when he talked about walls being used to keep people in as well as keeping people out. And of course, he was lampooned and he was ridiculed for saying that. And the Berlin Wall is the most glaring and vivid and dramatic example of that. In my lifetime, I'm old enough to remember people being shot fleeing, into West Germany, by the guards up on the wall, that divided Berlin. It's already too late anyways, demographically. We already, even if we were to be able to snap our fingers and have a complete comprehensive border wall on the entire southern border, it's already too late. Demographically, we have already passed the proverbial point of no return. The only hope, sadly, right now, is balkanization and secession and begin to try to retake that which has been stolen from us on a draconian scale. applaud you for taking the initiative to be bold and to be completely straightforward and open in this proclamation, because as I said, you are not only 100% right, if anything, you're understating the reality, with the exception that we could be in for another major false flag event that would be to 9/11, like 9/11 was to the Oklahoma bombing. Possibly a biological, something that numerically, at least in terms of the body count and the casualties, would dwarf even 9/11. And that, of course, could also be part of how Trump gets reelected. Because remember, whenever there's a national crisis of the magnitude of 9/11, the reflexive tendency of the entire body politic, is to rally around the leader, no matter how odious or objectionable he might be to a large percentage, of the body politic, to realize that people are, entrenched in power, who have zero morality, they have zero conscience, they will do anything and everything to attain their objective. But that's the world we live in. And again, we need to act as if it's all up to us and pray as if it's all up to God, because more than ever, we need divine assistance in our effort to resist this evil.
And we're going to break here for a commercial, and when we come back, I'll have Simon Roche on the phone, the leader of the Afrikaner activist group that's preparing for the upcoming civil war there in South Africa.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net.
Extra, read all about it.
Roche, welcome back to the Dixie Heritage Hour.
Yeah, you guys have got a big threat looming on the horizon, don't you?
Of course, you heard President Trump's comments. My response was almost as if the president was declaring war against me and my countrymen. You live in a country where government has declared war against you and your countrymen. Am I overreacting to this thing, or?
It's a good question, and I've debated this matter with some ardently pro-gun people in the USA, and they kind of didn't like my opinion. But I think that I speak for most of the Western world, other than the USA, that we find it strange how gun control is, because fundamentally a gun is a dangerous thing. And we recognize that most crimes are committed by people who don't have, they're illegal gun owners. We understand that. We get it. And we like guns. So in a sense, we're on your side. We're on your team. We feel the same way you do, but we struggle. Outside of the USA, the Western world struggles to understand how there can just be no control at all, or so very, very little control. And we're pro-gun, Ed. We want guns. We want guns to defend ourselves. We're being attacked on our farms. Our women are being raped. But we can't understand how you can sell such a damn dangerous thing to a dude without knowing whether he's a psychopath. No background checks in some states. Private sales completely unregulated. We struggle with it, Ed, to be honest. So I'm sorry that I haven't given you the answer you were looking for. Many of us are looking at what President Trump is saying, and to us it just makes perfect sense. Sorry. Okay. I'd say 9 out of 10 Westerners outside of the USA kind of sees it that way, I think.
Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers, he made a comment on why the Second Amendment was added to the Constitution. And basically what he said was that had the colonists not had weapons, they could have never overthrown the British government.
Yes.
And that the day will come when the government that he was helping to create would become just as despotic as the one they had thrown off.
Yes.
When that day came, you would have to have an armed populace so that it could defend itself against its own government. And that's why we're so dogmatic against gun control and regulation, and particularly when it's the government trying to impose this. Because the whole reason for us having a firearm isn't just to defend ourselves from a home intruder or to be able to go hunting, but for the inevitable day when we have to do, which sadly you're about to have to do if you're not already doing it, protect yourself from your own government.
And we get that. We couldn't concur more. We would just say, but if you have no control at all, don't get a look of surprise on your face when some guy massacres children in a classroom. Don't act surprised, because it's inevitable.
Okay.
There are always psychotic people in populations, and
I
I'm
guess
surrounded
my fear is that one of these days, if the wrong person's in power, normal people would be declared psychologically unstable.
You may be right there. You know, if you extrapolate the argument to its logical conclusion, you may well be right. You know, it's just not the way the rest of the world thinks. It's like Fahrenheit. It's pretty unique to the USA and pretty unique to the US mentality. And it works well for the USA. But in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, England, France, Luxembourg, Germany, I'm not saying that we all believe nobody should have guns, like in the UK. I'm not saying that people think that the extremes of Germany are good. Most red-blooded, right-wing Christian Caucasian men believe that it is their right to own a firearm, but it's not the right of the dude down the road who clearly has a psychological problem, who puts firecrackers up frogs' backsides, who chops the heads off cats, and over whom there's a lingering suspicion that he fondled 2 young girls. That dude, no guns, no way.
You know, if anything, you're kind of giving us an interesting perspective here, because the truth is that most of us here in the United States, we fall into the trap of thinking that either A, everybody's like us, or that we're better than everybody else, or that, you know, we're right and the rest of the world is wrong. Of course, you probably encountered that when you visited this country extensively as you have. So
it's okay to disagree. It's not the end of the world. We don't have to get sensitive about it. Sometimes the US thinks it's right, and it is right. Sometimes the US thinks it's right, and it's wrong. I get a lot of American visitors out here coming to see Saitlanders, right-wing Americans, good Christian people, good Caucasian people. They want to see Saitlanders. They want to see what we're doing to defend ourselves, how we're preparing for the Civil War. They want to meet the farmers, go onto the farms. And naturally, when we're driving 400 miles to reach a certain location, they'll ask me questions about this and, different things. And I'll say to them, look, you've asked the question, so I'm going to answer it. I'm not trying to offend you. You're a guest of mine. But we think that American beer is shit. It's rubbish.
My German uncle thought the same way. That's why he brewed his own.
Man on the moon. Sometimes you're better, sometimes you're worse. And it's the same with us. Beef jerky is about the most horrible thing that a human being could be forced to eat. Our biltong, by contrast, is magnificent. It's sold all over the world. You guys have the biggest economy in the world. Sometimes you're better, sometimes you're not. It's okay.
Simon, text me your postal address. And the next time I make a batch of beef jerky, because I don't like the beef jerky that they sell in the store. I think that stuff's nasty myself, which is why I make my own.
Okay.
But the next time I make a batch of beef jerky, I will mail you some, and you can tell me if mine's just as nasty as all the rest of it. Or
I've only ever had the store-bought beef jerky, and if you prove me wrong, I will be the first to admit it, and I will do so in public.
Okay.
It will gratify me, to be honest.
And I look forward to that vindication. Just trying to give us some kind of perspective there. I know you're all the way over in South Africa, but again, we're trying to get your perspective. So give us that perspective on all of this.
I am struggling with this thing, as are many people, I think, just to comprehend it. It's difficult to comprehend how psychotic maniacs can be able to obtain such powerfully destructive weapons. We don't understand it. We just don't comprehend it. But on the other hand, what is equally difficult to understand is how these events, the timing of these events, and the strange characteristics of them. I'm going to use a different example now. and I hope it doesn't fudge the argument, or I hope it doesn't dilute the argument. The Las Vegas shooting. Nothing makes sense. It just doesn't make sense. There's a report being released recently by Europhysics, very highbrow, superior physics magazine. Their conclusion is, this panel of guys, top physics dudes in the world, that all three of the World Trade Center tower collapses, in other words, 1, 2, and 7, towers 1, 2, and 7, were brought about by controlled demolition. I don't even know what to believe. I don't know whether to believe there were mass shootings because the timing is so uncanny.
Well, I've got video footage, Simon.
Epstein, and the next thing, all white people are bad.
Right.
Come on.
Well, you've already heard earlier in the program the clip from the Fox News Channel 14 there in El Paso, where they were reporting the shooting before it had occurred. And the news commentator lady was saying, oh, wait, that hasn't happened yet.
Happened at the Walmart in Horizon. I'm not sure what time this tweet went out. However, here it is, at 3 p.m. Well, that hasn't happened yet. Okay, so today is the 3rd.
This is 30. Wow.
And Pat Shannan is the one who pointed me to the video for years. He was the editor of the American Free Press.
Or send it to me by Skype. This is just too much for my mind.
Yeah. And, of course, if you remember during the World Trade Center, what you were talking about, that they had reported the collapse of the third building of Tower Number 7, I think it was like 15 minutes before it happened. The BBC was reporting it before it even happened.
Ed, you guys are being done in by your government in a way that I don't think has ever happened in the history of mankind. I can't think of any examples that compare of a nation, a country, being deliberately devastated by its own masters in the history of mankind.
Well, I guess what really scared me more than anything, essentially in the president's comments, because all of the things that he was I guess two things scared me. One was the fact that he was calling for several things at once. In other words, usually in reaction to an event, there's one or two things that they want to push. It seemed like there was a laundry list this time. The other thing that scared me was that essentially, the president is saying that racism should be punished by the death penalty. And I'm not advocating for racism by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not advocating for racism. In a free society, people are entitled to opinions, even bad ones. To make hatred or bigotry a capital crime and to execute people for it, I mean, Orwell didn't go that far. And then who decides what is racism? I mean, that's even scarier.
And you find that very much in South Africa. And it's coming to a USA near you. There are no two ways about this. You find it very much in South Africa where white people's motives, when their actions are not in the interests of black people, are always assumed to be racist. In other words, I did something to the detriment of a black person, it must have been racism. It becomes a default position, and it's a default position that you can't really dispute. I mean, how do you say, well, no, I was nasty to you because I didn't like you, not because you're black? You can't win the argument. You can only advance a contrary argument. In the eyes of the society, they see, well, you've got one opinion, he's got another opinion, and frankly, we're more sympathetic to him. You can never win that one. Never. So result that white people in South Africa walk on eggshells when they're around black people. There is a tendency amongst a certain category of white women to talk about white men as white men, but black men as African gentlemen. They are so terrified of being accused of being racist that they overdo their reaction. They overreact. They resort to pandering. They're just trying to look after themselves. Some people are more courageous, perhaps, or bolder, and they don't descend to that level. But you can't really blame cowardly or weak or timid people for being afraid.
But I do want to thank you for sharing a few comments with us and for chiming in on this event and giving us a perspective that's definitely giving us the perspective of the rest of the world.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure, Ed. It's always a pleasure to deal with you and to talk to you. And share your work with as many people as I know.
We are out of time, so I'm going to cut it here. It's been a privilege and an honor to be able to stand behind the Golden Dixie Heritage microphone and bring you yet another episode of TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. I have just had a memo handed to me. The clip that we have been playing of the Fox News footage may have been a third shooting that did not take place this weekend. When the Fox News cast reported a 3 o'clock shooting before it had happened, that maybe that was enough to cause that last shooting to be canceled. We don't know what's going on. All we know for sure is that something is rotten in the state of Denmark, or should I say, something is rotten in these United States of America. And that's why we brought you this special broadcast. So if you'll go to our website, www.dixieheritage.net, I'd love to send you a free copy of my book and newsletter. And I look forward to seeing you again, or rather, should I say, speaking to you again next week. So from all of us here at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, God bless.